Yes. Probably. I haven't read every Stephen King book, so I can't definitively say if Pet Sematary is his scariest novel. But I think what's more important to talk about is the fact that this might be his darkest novel. Again, hard for me to say, I haven't read all of them. But what I can speak to is how this book made me feel, and for lack of a better phrase, it bummed me out. Pet Sematary is dark as hell for so many reasons. One of which, inarguably, is the fact that it is really, really frightening. But why? Why is Pet Sematary so frightening? Let's talk about it. First of all, quick summary for anyone who hasn't read it or seen the film adaptations. Pet Sematary is a Stephen King novel about a man called Louis/Louis Creed. I say Louis/Louis because the way his name is spelled in this book makes me, a British person, want to say Louis. But this is an American novel, and so I'm sure it's supposed to be Louis. Interestingly, halfway through this book, I was saying Louis in my head, and then at some point I switched to Louis. Don't know why. It's like it got in my head. Anywho, Louis Creed is a doctor, and he's recently been hired by a university to be the chief medical person at this university in Maine. He's moved into a new house on a very, very busy road, along with his wife Rachel and their 2 kids, one of whom is a toddler. And they also have a family cat called Winston Churchill, or Church for short. A lot of this setup, as the introduction of my copy explains, was inspired by King's own life. He worked at a university for a time, they gave him a house to live in, the house was on a really busy road. All of that was true. And at the time, King had a toddler. I know that he's got 2 sons, Joe Hill, the author, and Owen King, the author, so I'm guessing it was one of them. But in the book, and again in King's own life, behind that house is a pet cemetery. The cemetery is in a dense forest that his house backs onto. The forest goes on for miles and miles, and people get lost there a lot. The pet cemetery is full of animal graves. Local people lose their pets a lot in this area because of this busy road. There's a factory in the nearby town, and enormous trucks barrel up and down this road all the time. So pet mortality is high. And in the introduction, King talks about the fact that his toddler ran towards this road one day. And to this day, he doesn't remember exactly what happened. Either the kid fell down before he reached the road, or King himself managed to grab the kid. He can't remember, and I find that so eerie and understandable given the adrenaline rush that would be going on in that moment. But one of Stephen King's sons narrowly escaped death by this road. So this novel was enormously inspired by King's own lived experiences. But it's a Stephen King novel, which means it goes to even stranger places. Now, across the street from Louis and Rachel's house is this elderly man called Judd and his wife, who suffers with really bad arthritis. Judd is a really, really charming old guy, and he's one of the more famous Stephen King characters. He has this thick local accent, and the character and his accent were brought to life brilliantly in the original film adaptation by Fred Gwynne. His portrayal of Judd has been satirized, I guess, in various media, including South Park. I remember very distinctly a character in South Park based off Judd, and I thought back to that character as I was reading the book because I grew up on South Park. Judd is the one that tells Louis about the pet cemetery. Judd knows the truth of the cemetery as well, that it has an annex, an extra bit that is very, very difficult to get to. The walk to this annex is treacherous, but it will play a part later in the novel. There's not really much point in me skirting around this as if it's a spoiler. Everyone knows what happens in Pet Sematary. In fact, Stephen King was a huge fan of the Ramones. The Ramones are referenced in this book, and King actually invited the Ramones to his house, gave Dee Dee Ramone a copy of this book. Dee Dee went down into the basement, and a few hours later came back with the lyrics to their song Pet Sematary, which is featured in the closing credits of the original film. I also grew up on the Ramones, and Pet Sematary is my favourite Ramones song. Fun fact about me. The chorus of Pet Sematary goes, "I don't want to be buried in a pet cemetery, I don't want to live my life again." That in itself spoils what happens, so I'm not going to skirt around it. If you bury a pet or a person in the annex part of the pet cemetery, they will come back to life, but they'll come back wrong. And as Judd says in the most famous line of this book, maybe the most famous line that Stephen King ever wrote, Sometimes dead is better.
Sometimes dead is better.
Now, when it comes to how scary this book is, I think the reason people often call it the scariest Stephen King novel is because it's so oppressive in its atmosphere. And it's so dark from so many different angles. When I finished Pet Sematary, the only thing I could think about was the fact that it's all about death. Death is everything in this book. Everything dies. And some of those things come back. If you're someone who fears death, if you're someone who's ever suffered a really tragic loss, if you're someone who's come close to death yourself, any of those things and more, this book will shake you. It shook me, and I'm not all that familiar with death, honestly. Not in a really intimate way like so many people unfortunately are. But I do fear it very, very intensely. And Pet Sematary really got to me. Early on in the novel, after he's settled into his work at the university, Lewis has to treat a man who comes in with fatal injuries. He has been smushed up. He's dying, he's bleeding from everywhere, he's cracked and broken, and his ghost starts to plague Lewis's life. I don't want to say haunt him, I feel like plague is the right word here. After that happens, death is everywhere. Not just in the fact that many people and things die in the book, but also the fact that every conversation is about death. Lewis's wife Rachel, who's a really interesting character in the book, she's terrified of death in an almost childish way. King isn't always great at writing women, quite famously, but Rachel I found really fascinating as a character. She has this pathetic attitude towards death, and we learn later on why that is. Something happened in her childhood that was really traumatic and encourages you to sympathize with her in a very deep way. And because of that, she doesn't like talking about death or thinking about death, and she's passed that fear on to her daughter, who's only like 6 years old, and she hates the idea of their beloved cat dying, which of course it will. I'm pretty sure the cover gives that away. And Lewis reminds Rachel multiple times that we are very close to death. All of us, all the time. In fact, I'll tell you a story about when I did come very close to death, because that just came to me as I was saying this. About 10 years ago, I was driving to Liverpool from London on my way to a job interview. My car broke down, it overheated or something. I pulled over on the side of the motorway, called the repair people, AA or whatever. The guy comes along, he's really lovely and he looks at the car and blah blah blah. We're standing on the side of the road and I'm looking at the car and my back is to the road. The road is going that way and I've got my back to it. And I get lost in thought thinking about the job interview and the car and how much it's going to cost and blah blah blah. And I start stepping backwards without thinking. And the guy, really lovely guy, just put his hand gently on my back. He was stood side by side with me and he just pushed me just forwards towards the car again. Said, "Oh, careful, careful." If he hadn't noticed that I took a few steps back, it would have taken 2 more steps for me to get wiped out by a truck in that moment. I was 2 steps away from death. And I think about that quite a lot. Because if the multiverse is real, there are an infinite number of worlds where I was wiped out by a truck in that moment. So when Lewis says to his wife in this book that death is everywhere, and we are always close to it, anything can happen to anyone at any time, he's right. All the time, death is close, and the road that their house sits on is proof of that. Quite often as you're reading the book, they're on the porch having a beer, having a conversation. Lewis arrives home, he gets out of the car, Rachel greets him, whatever. Something happens and a truck barrels along. You can hear it. You can hear the horn. You can hear the rush of the wind, the tires on the road. It is absolutely constant that they are sitting at the edge of the river Styx, these people. Death is there constantly. And they mess around with it. They play with death. They invite it in. They fight back against it. They do hideous things with this pet cemetery. Or rather, the cemetery itself does awful things and they give into it. Lewis gives into it more than once. There are stories that Judd tells in the book about his life, about his childhood, about his relationship to the pet cemetery. One story in particular about someone who used the cemetery in a way that no one ever should, the one forbidden way, although I guess they're all forbidden. He tells that story to Lewis, and it really shook me. It's really gross, it's creepy, and it feels taboo. This is such a dark book. And again, in the introduction, Stephen King talks about just how dark it is. He talks about the fact that he wrote it, he was inspired by things that happened to him, a real Pet Sematary, a real Judd character that he met, a real road that he lived by, which almost killed one of his children. So many of these things inspired him, and so he was compelled to write the book. But he didn't expect it to ever get published. He didn't think it should be. But in the introduction, he explains that he owed his publisher one more book before he shifted to a new publisher, and he had that book. And so he gave it to them, and it's one of his most famous and successful books. It's had 2 film adaptations, and King himself was frightened of it, I think. His wife loved it and encouraged him to get it published, and here we are. One of the darkest novels I've ever read. It is frightening because of how oppressive it is, because the novel is addicted to death, to dying, to loss. And all the themes that you expect come wrapped up in it. Family, tradition, loss, grief, turmoil, the way that families are connected by life and death, the fact that so many of our traditions are wrapped up in death. The book gets you thinking a lot about funerals, about grief, about people going on after losing loved ones. There is constant thinking about death as you read the book, after you finish it. And for that reason, it is so harrowingly oppressive. And I think because this is Stephen King's darkest book, it's also his most frightening, because it reminds you of your fragility, your humanity, your mortality. We are close to death, all of us, all the time. As someone who is scared of dying, as many people are, it got to me. And it made me think about what scary actually is. The idea of being afraid of something is very much tied up with what we already fear, what phobias we have, what things we don't like thinking or talking about. And there are films, and there are books, and there are video games that have scared me and haven't scared other people, and vice versa. One of my favourite films in the entire world is Ari Aster's Hereditary. I love that film, and I think Toni Collette should have got an Oscar for it. She's incredible. But despite the fact that Hereditary is one of my favourite movies, it's also the film that has frightened me the most. I've never been so scared of a film as I was by Hereditary. But I have a friend who is also a big horror movie fan. She and I talked about the film once. We both really enjoyed it, but she didn't find it scary. And in fact, the moments that really made my skin crawl in the 3rd act of that film, they made her laugh. She thought it was goofy and campy, still good, but not serious enough to be frightening, and I can't understand where she's coming from. Because all of those things kept me up that night. I couldn't sleep thinking about that film. We experience horror in very different ways, and things that scare you won't scare me and vice versa. This book is scary for everyone, I think, because of how oppressive it is, because of its addiction to death. Death is the big unifier, and it is the big scary thing. Everyone's scared of death. It's primal, it's human nature, it's animal nature to be scared of death, and to be scared of losing loved ones to death. The book makes it so that you have no choice but to be scared. No matter what elements, what moments scare you, you'll be scared, because this book is nothing but death. Now it's time for my Patreon book recommendation of the week. This recommendation comes from Leslie, who has recommended Family Meal by Brian Washington. I've read Brian Washington before, but I'd never heard of this book. It must be a pretty new one. Leslie says, it wasn't actually a favourite of mine, but I know that a lot of people really love the book. I will say it was very well written, and I'd love to read other works by him. This is kind of a fun recommendation to do because I loved his novel Memorial, which I think was his debut. I thought Memorial was a really, really clever piece of queer fiction. I did a video on it way back when I looked quite different. The video is not very good, and I distinctly remember spending half of it chopping mushrooms, trying to do something clever. But this is a great opportunity for me to read more Brian Washington. I get to check out Family Meal, didn't know it existed, and for me to tell you that you should read Memorial. More Brian Washington, his stuff is great. Thank you, Leslie. And if you'd like to give me your book recommendations, which I will read out at the end of videos, you can support me on Patreon. If you enjoy what I do and you think I've earned your support, well, you'll be keeping me going, keeping my lights on, so I'd really appreciate it. Thank you, and subscribe for books.